In the aftermath of the ceasefire deal in the Gaza Strip, a complex standoff is unfolding on multiple fronts as Israeli forces, militant organizations and regional players maneuver for advantage. At the center of the latest escalation is a group of around 150 militants from the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades trapped in subterranean tunnels that extend into territory controlled by Israel Defense Forces, IDF, across the so-called Yellow Line. Israeli officials say the militants remained underground when the ceasefire took effect, either because they did not receive the order or were abandoned by commanders. The IDF stresses these fighters have already carried out attacks on Israeli troops that resulted in casualties, and thus safe passage back to Gaza has been firmly rejected by the Israeli political leadership. According to the IDF, combat engineers from the Nahal Brigade and tunnel clearance teams have been focused on the large network beneath Rafah's Janina neighborhood, where the group is located. Israeli officials say this network lies partially beneath the Israeli side of the Yellow Line and that the trapped militants are attempting to use mediators to negotiate a return to Gaza. Meanwhile, families of Israeli hostages killed in captivity, as well as Israel's government, have spoken out in opposition to any deal that would allow the militants to walk away. Hamas is meanwhile portrayed by Israeli analysts as deliberately delaying the implementation of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza in order to reinforce its internal position. Officials claim the organization is buying time to rebuild and train fresh forces, inflating a humanitarian crisis ahead of coming winter to increase international leverage, holding back on handing over the remains of hostages, citing rubble and access issues as pretext, and exerting tighter control over civil life inside Gaza, including supervising food distribution centers, enforcing price controls, and punishing suspected collaborators. In one recent raid on a tunnel system near Bet Anoun, IDF forces, with the assistance of the Shin Bet, eliminated 11 militants, including field-grade commanders, after locating the site using intelligence guidance. In New York this week, the United States Department of State formally submitted a draft resolution to the United Nations Security Council suite aimed at establishing an international security force in Gaza for at least 2 years, ending in 2027 with a possible extension. The proposed tasks of this force include securing the borders of the Gaza Strip with Israel and Egypt, protecting humanitarian corridors and civilians, training and mentoring a Palestinian police force after screening and vetting, and overseeing the demilitarization of Gaza, including the permanent dismantling of terror infrastructures and non-state weapon systems. A U.S. official indicated that the force could begin deployment as early as January. Negotiations on the draft are expected in the coming days ahead of a vote in the UNSC. However, tensions are rising. Israel opposes the resolution's language, granting broad powers and supports excluding certain regional actors, such as Turkey and Qatar, from the force's command. The Palestinian Authority insists on full UN authorization, while Hamas remains ambivalent given the implications for its armed wing. The draft foresees governance structure in which the force operates under a unified command acceptable to Gaza's board of peace in close coordination with Israel and Egypt. It further envisions the creation of a technocratic, apolitical Palestinian administration for Gaza, supervised by an international board tasked with reconstruction and funds tracking. In southern Lebanon, the IDF confirmed the elimination of Abbas Hassan Karki, logistics commander of Hezbollah's southern front, in a strike on 24 October. Israeli authorities said Karki had led efforts to rebuild Hezbollah's combat capabilities south of the Litani River. The elimination comes amid broader Israeli assessments that Hezbollah is rearming and preparing for renewed confrontation. In a closed-door cabinet meeting, Israel's decision-makers reviewed response options against Hezbollah's violations of the 2023 ceasefire, including plans for intensified military operations. While an immediate large-scale escalation is not yet confirmed, intelligence officials warn that Hezbollah's confidence has increased, born of its assessment that Israel is occupied with Gaza and domestic politics. Meanwhile, in Syria, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is extending Turkish influence. He announced a broad assistance plan in the Syrian theatre while reiterating criticism of Israel. Ankara is also deepening its role as mediator with Hamas, complicating the regional dynamic. Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar, gave a high-profile interview this week in which he described the Gaza ceasefire as disappointing and frustrating due to repeated violations, with Israeli strikes described as disproportionate and Hamas accused of breaching the truce. He said the ceasefire remains very fragile and complex. He emphasized the need for a monitoring and coordination mechanism with Egypt and the United States to document violations. On the question of an international force in Gaza, he said, the rule of the international force should be to ensure security for both the Palestinians and the Israelis alike, so that neither side poses a threat to the other. He clarified that Arab or Islamic countries would not deploy troops tasked with shooting at Palestinians, underscoring the central dilemma of the plan. In Tehran, Mohammad Javad Larijani, advisor to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, stated that Iran has the technological capability to build an atomic bomb in less than 2 weeks. But that development is prevented only by Khamenei's religious edict, fatwa forbidding nuclear weapons. The remarks reflect a familiar posture of ambition and restraint, but this time the regime faces heightened internal pressure. Iran's economy is under strain. Major cities are facing environmental decline, and widespread protests have become more frequent. Observers note the regime appears isolated regionally and internationally. The situation in Gaza remains highly volatile, and the tunnel network problem illustrates the enduring difficulty of eliminating militant entrenchment once it is established. For Israel, the presence of militants underneath its side of the line poses a security dilemma. Allow them to withdraw and risk political backlash, or seek their elimination and risk a broader escalation. Meanwhile, Hamas appears to seek a pause, not a cessation of hostilities. The delay strategies suit its internal consolidation goals. The international force proposal represents a pivot in US policy from supporting Israel's unilateral operations toward multilateral stabilization and reconstruction. Yet the inclusion or exclusion of regional players and the question of an enforcement versus peacekeeping role ensure that the draft will face fierce debate. On the northern front, Hezbollah's resurgence warns that Israel cannot yet draw down its multi-front posture. With the Syrian theatre evolving and Turkey positioning itself as both mediator and power broker, Israel must juggle multiple adversarial axes, even as it concentrates on Gaza. Finally, Iran's dual posture nuclear ambition and domestic instability means that Tel Aviv cannot treat the current war as confined. The regime's funding of proxies, combined with its own weakening legitimacy, may drive more desperate strategies. Around 150 militants of the Al-Qassam brigades remain trapped in a tunnel complex beneath the Israeli side of the Yellow Line. Israel refuses to grant safe passage. Hamas is accused of delaying the full implementation of the ceasefire, manipulating the hostage remains handover, and using winter humanitarian concerns as leverage. The US has submitted a draft UNSC resolution for a 2-year international force in Gaza tasked with borders, demilitarization and training a Palestinian police force. Israel eliminated Hezbollah's Southern Front logistics commander Abbas Hassan Kaki, underscoring Lebanon's growing role in a multi-front confrontation. Qatar's PM emphasized the ceasefire's fragility and warned that Arab countries will not deploy troops to use force against Palestinians. Iran claims near-term bomb-building capability, but is constrained by internal religious edicts and by growing domestic dysfunction and protest. Litmus test scenarios lie ahead. If the tunnel fighters are eliminated or removed, Israel will claim a tactical victory, but risks provoking underground resistance. If the international force enters Gaza in January as envisioned, it may stabilize one front but complicate Israel's freedom of maneuver and entangle it in new governance dynamics. In the north, Hezbollah may seize the lull in Gaza to rebuild, forcing Israel to maintain readiness and diplomatic agility. Ultimately, the war is not over, just evolving. With multiple theatres, fluid alliances and shifting roles of regional actors like Qatar and Turkey, Israel faces a protracted phase in which every front must be managed concurrently. The risk is that protracted entrenchment, be it tunnels in Gaza, Hezbollah infrastructure in Lebanon, or Iran's proxy network, leaves Israel fighting for years to come.